So to get, thank you, Nishant. So to get to today's topic, um, today we have the great pleasure of having one of the featured speakers from the UC Davis Global Energy Managers Conference, who is here to present to us today. Um, Her topic is obviously very focused on ways to broaden the electrification process and also how it applies to those to people of all ranges throughout not only our nation but also our world. And so I'm very much looking forward to our presentation today. Mina is a senior research associate at Lawrence Berkeley Labs, and she's also a graduate of UC Davis. Hooray, because that's local to us. She's worked a lot in clean energy technology and has great connections throughout not only Lawrence Berkeley Labs, but also throughout the energy industry and specifically also with UC Davis. Um, uh, Her degree, a Master of Science in Energy Systems from UC Davis. And so I will happily turn over the microphone to Mina so that you can start sharing your slides and we can hear more about your topic today. I will go
Thank
stop
you,
share.
Heather. Yeah, I'll just take a minute to share slides from my end.
So would you prefer, if people have questions, would you like them to hold them to the end or have them put them in the chat and we can pop them in as appropriate?
Yeah, I think holding them to the end would be good. If they want to keep it in the chat as we're going along, that sounds good.
Excellent.
Okay, so just wanted to make sure, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay.
There we go. Perfect.
Okay, great. Yes, so thank you very much to Heather and Nishant for asking me to come and speak on this topic and for AE NorCal for providing this platform. I think it's people may be familiar with these terms, equity, energy justice, or just hear them coming up a lot in the conversation, increasingly in the energy field, but may not be familiar with exactly how to apply these terms to your specific projects that you're working on. And so I will hopefully be able to shed some light on that based on some of the experiences that I've had or that I've seen how people apply these concepts to energy projects. And so some of those experiences that I'll be drawing from, I just wanted to highlight a couple of them. So when I was a graduate student at UC Davis in the energy graduate group, I was helping my professor, Kurt Kornblith, with a Path to Zero Net Energy graduate course where the students would work on um, projects with outside clients in small teams. And we really wanted to incorporate the concept of equity into this class so students could apply equity to their projects rather than just having a guest lecturer come and talk about this concept, but then the students wouldn't really do anything with this information. So from incorporating equity for the first time in that class, that's where a lot of the examples that I'll be talking about later come from. And then once I started working for Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, which is a Department of Energy national laboratory, I really got to see more of what's going on at the federal level in terms of equity, kind of at the policy level as well, and think about equity in some of my research projects, and see what other people are doing at the lab related to equity. And also, I'll be talking a bit about the lab's IDEA office, which is inclusion, diversity, equity, and accountability. The lab has a specific office for incorporating these principles into the workplace as well as into research projects. And I'll be talking both about incorporating equity in the projects themselves, as well as some tips for incorporating it in the workplace that are based on the lab's IDEA progress report, which talked about some actions the lab has taken to incorporate these ideas in research and in the workplace. So yeah, those are kind of the various experiences that I'll be drawing from to talk about how you can apply these things to your work and the workplace. So first I wanted to just do a quick poll. Hopefully this works out well and we don't have any technical issues, but Yeah, just wanted to see where everyone's familiarity is in terms of the topics that we'll be talking about today. And let's see, can I do this while sharing? Maybe not. Oh, yeah, there you go.
So do you know where it should show up on our screens? I don't know
It
if,
should show up in a window.
okay.
Okay, yeah, I see people are filling it out.
Oh, good.
Yeah. If you're not able to see it for whatever reason, the questions are, how familiar are you with the topics of equity slash justice? Familiar, somewhat familiar, not very familiar. Feel free to respond in the chat if you're not able to see the poll. And then the second question is, are you currently implementing equity slash justice in your work right now? Yes, I've applied these concepts to projects. Not yet, but I'm planning to. And no, I haven't applied these concepts. Okay, so it looks like there's kind of people are equally familiar, somewhat familiar, not very familiar with these projects. There's kind of a range. And then in terms of applying these concepts to projects, a good number of you have already done that. And then there's some who are not yet planning to, and some who have not applied these concepts. So yeah, hopefully for those of you who are not super familiar, like that's completely fine. That's sort of the whole purpose of this webinar. So I'll be going over some definitions and examples that can help with that. Okay, let me go back to sharing my screen. Okay, so in terms of what I'll be talking about today, I'll first cover what does equity mean, some definitions, and why it's important, and then kind of higher level federal government and Berkeley Lab efforts um, to incorporate these concepts. And then in terms of for you to apply it to your energy projects, I'll cover a framework that you can use, and then some real life examples from Berkeley Lab's IDEA office, as well as the class at UC Davis that I mentioned. So in terms of what is equity, I kind of wanted to start with this distinction between equity and justice. I know that I used both terms in the title of this talk, and that was mostly because I thought some people might be familiar with one term versus the other, but just to distinguish them. So equity is kind of the place that we want to get to. It's about fairness in terms of the distribution of resources and access to opportunities. And justice is kind of more embedding equity into systems. It's that systemic change that leads to long-term equity. So just so you're aware, this kind of the difference in the definitions. And in terms of equity as it's applied to energy projects, I like to refer to this definition from the Initiative for Energy Justice. And that's because it talks about achieving equity in terms of the participation in the energy system. So, who's involved in the processes. And it also talks about alleviating the burdens on those that have been historically harmed by the energy system. So talking about equity in process and also equity in terms of the outcomes. And I'll kind of be focusing on both today, just so you're aware. So talking about equity in process, who's involved in the energy field, some equity challenges that there might be for minorities or people who have been historically underrepresented in the energy field that may include biases in recruitment, hiring, and promotion. So one example of that, it doesn't always have to be explicit bias. Sometimes it's implicit bias that can come from, the way that people grow up kind of influences the way that they think about what makes a suitable candidate. So that can show up in interviews and in the hiring process. And then in terms of workplace culture, there are certain um, things that might lead for minorities in the workplace to feel like it's a sort of less pleasant environment or even hostile environment to be in. And that includes microaggressions. So those little everyday interactions that may cause offense because of kind of intrinsic racism or sexism, for example, and these microaggressions can really add up and cause the workplace to be a less pleasant environment to be in. And then there can be certain workplace policies or practices that are inequitable. And I wanted to point out that it might not be something that's explicit in a policy, but they might leave room for unspoken criteria. So if we look at hiring policies, if there's no explicit criteria that calls out, what makes a suitable candidate, then that leaves room for implicit bias in the process, for example. So these are all things that can lead, that can cause it to be hard for minorities in the energy field to advance or even enter the field in the first place. And then on a community level, kind of looking at the impact side, right? What's happened is, historically, frontline communities that experience the burdens of climate change a lot, they have been historically left out of energy system planning processes, and the community perspectives were often not considered in energy projects, in siting power plants, for example. And so those kinds of practices have concentrated environmental harms in certain communities. And another example of that is redlining, where these redline communities, they kind of face increased economic burdens because they have been prevented from accessing financial services in the same way as other communities. And these are also communities that, like research has shown, they have like less tree cover, they are more concentrated in terms of the hazardous waste sites that are located in those communities. So a lot of things that cause health burdens to people living there because of these historical practices. And then, so these are communities that would benefit a lot from electrification or decarbonization efforts. But we also need to be mindful of when we're electrifying, there may be some, adverse impacts to these communities. So we need to think about when we're electrifying residences, for example, in places where electricity is more expensive than gas, are vulnerable residents going to see increased energy bills rather than lower costs? So yeah, these are all kind of considerations and challenges that vulnerable communities might face. And these are all things that we would want to address in our projects and things that the federal government has been trying to address at a policy level. So one of the main things I wanted to highlight in terms of federal government efforts is the Justice 40 initiative. So that's trying to ensure that 40% of the benefits of federal clean energy investments flow towards disadvantaged communities. And there's also a broader effort, a couple of executive orders that are trying to embed equity into the federal government and into federal agencies. So those policies have called, for example, for equity action plans and equity action teams within federal agencies. And then in terms of the Justice 40 initiative, the government has been defining who those disadvantaged communities are that the benefits flow to. So they do that through the climate and economic justice screening tool, which is actually a tool that's it's available online. You can just search it up if you're interested in looking more into it. So yeah, they've been defining who these communities are, and they've also been providing funding announcements and technical assistance so that communities located in these areas can take advantage of the benefits of clean energy transition. And then in terms of efforts at Berkeley Lab, I'll talk first about equity in research. So there's a couple of different categories I think about. So one is kind of higher level thinking of frameworks for applying to the kind of energy work that we do. So for example, a framework for deep decarbonization modeling that's based in energy justice. And then also looking at the state level policy actions that are taken for energy equity. So these are kind of higher level looks at energy equity. And then there's kind of more application-based projects or working directly to get community input. So for example, a community action plan to improve clean energy access in Fresno, California, which is considered a disadvantaged community by many measures. And then a couple of projects that I'm a little bit involved with. One of them is working towards low-cost solutions for residential decarbonization. There was a single-family database of retrofit measures, and then now we're looking into multifamily database of energy retrofit costs. Sorry. And then the other project is trying to think about ways that commercial solar that's installed in commercial buildings or commercial sites, how that can be leveraged to support disadvantaged communities during natural disasters or power outages. So that's a concept that we're exploring right now. Yeah, to try and address some of those community barriers that I was talking about earlier. So yeah, this is just also a snapshot of the things that are going on at the lab. I know there's several other projects that I haven't been able to talk about, but yeah, just to give you an idea of what kind of what equity looks like in energy research. So now focusing on, how can you apply these concepts? So this is kind of like the framework that we gave the students in the Zero Net Energy class when we asked them to think about equity in their projects. And this comes from, a paper from 2017. There's a lot of literature around this that's kind of about defining energy and environmental justice, but I like to use this one for simplicity. And so I'll just go over these are the 4 dimensions that we got students to think about. For each of these, how can you think about implementing equity in your projects? So the first one is just procedural. So that's talking about broad and meaningful participation in the decision-making process. Recognition justice involves respecting and honoring divergent cultural and local knowledge. Distributive justice is about the equitable distribution of environmental benefits and burdens. And restorative justice is about repairing harms done to communities and to the environment, those historical harms that I was talking about earlier. So I think it's simpler to think about, each of these areas of justice in terms of questions that you can then apply to your workplace or to projects. So this is kind of how I've framed them. For procedural justice, first talking about the workforce, you can think about who is part of your workforce, how do you make it more diverse? And for recognition justice, you can think about who you're recognizing in your policies and initiatives. So not just who is part of your workforce, but then who are you thinking about within your policies and initiatives. And then for distributive justice, you can think about how the impacts of your policies or initiatives are being distributed. And for restorative justice, how you can right historic harms through policy changes or initiatives. So taking these questions, I just wanted to keep these in mind as we're going over some of the examples from the IDEA progress report at Berkeley Lab. So these examples I'll pull from the report have to do with steps that Berkeley Lab has taken towards a more diverse, inclusive workplace, and can hopefully give a starting point for, maybe something that you can do in your workplace. So in the progress report, Berkeley Lab highlighted these strategic priorities. In the interest of time, I probably won't go over all of them, but just so you have an idea, these are the kind of priorities that the lab has. And for each of these priorities, they identified activities and outputs and outcomes that they were tracking towards progress on each of these priorities. So I won't go over every single one of those either, but I just have them in the slides in case you want to refer back to them for some more ideas. So yeah, just in terms of representation, I'll highlight that we have an equity advisor program. So some equity advisors were trained who sat on hiring panels for some recruitment processes. So these equity advisors helped to combat that implicit bias that I was talking about earlier, where people's experiences, can contribute to them being unintentionally biased towards some candidates than others. And then for career development, there are some mentoring programs that are happening at the lab, including just-in-time mentoring, where people can more easily access mentoring. It doesn't have to be a long-term thing if they need help in the moment. And this received a lot of positive feedback. In terms of inclusion, there's been a number of policy changes. So those include parental and family care bonding leave. And for each of these, the progress report highlights, the number of policies that have been revised, the number of people that have been helped or participated in these initiatives. So that helps, to ensure that we're not just doing these actions related to equity in a void, we're actually tracking what their outcomes are. And yeah, that relates to the last piece on accountability. So, one of the things that the lab did was to create this progress report in order to track how the lab is doing towards incorporating all these principles into the workplace and into research. So yeah, these are some examples of things that you can do at the workplace level and maybe encourage your workplace to do. So switching gears and talking more on the energy project side, trying to incorporate these principles into your work. I've reframed each of these questions so you can think for procedural justice on who is on your project. For recognition justice, you can consider who are you recognizing in your project? And distributive justice, how are your project impacts being distributed between different groups? And for restorative justice, how could you right historic harms through your projects? Um, and so I'll now talk about the UC Davis Zero Energy class and how students considered some or all of these dimensions in their projects. So one of the examples that I usually like to start out with is this project that was about estimating the building occupancy using Wi-Fi data in order to tune the building's HVAC schedules, and switch it off when people were not using it or not in the building and so on. I like to use this example because um, you might not immediately think that there can be equity considerations in this type of very technical project, but the students were able to come up with a number of considerations for equity, which I thought were pretty interesting. So one of them, for example, is this idea of cultural inclusion, the fact that holidays vary in different cultures. So during Thanksgiving, for example, it might be that a lot of students go home during the holidays, and there are less people in the building and less Wi-Fi data usage. But then you might not want to shut off the building because there are students that, don't go back home, don't celebrate this holiday. So these are some things that you should consider in your project. Um, and that also kind of relates to recognition justice because it considers how you're recognizing different people from different groups in your system, right? So another thing related to recognition justice, making sure that your signage is accessible. So for this project that was helping students understand commercial HVAC at UC Davis, they had a model of a miniature HVAC system that was sitting in the library, and they had some signage around it so that students could learn more about, what HVAC systems are and how they can reduce energy. And this was a kind of specific project, but the things that the students found can be applied to any signage that you have around your facility, like safety signage in a manufacturing facility, for example. So some of the things that they considered was that the signage would be American Disabilities Act compliant, and there would be English captions in the video animations that they had. And the demonstration should be held in a physically accessible space. So you can think about how all of these things can be applied to any signage that you have around your facility. Also along similar lines, in terms of accessibility, these students, they kind of took it one step further and looked at how different web dashboards for energy usage that were displaying energy usage did in terms of web accessibility. They were making some improvements to an energy dashboard, and in their criteria for scoring different case studies, they wanted to include this web accessibility score that was available through a couple of different online tools. So these are some tools that you can consider if you have anything that's web-based in terms of a dashboard or website platform. So some of the students, they also looked at a number of different elements of energy justice and some considerations for their project. So for this particular project, I was looking at reducing the glycol cooling load at a brewery. Students thought about procedural justice in terms of engaging kind of relevant stakeholders on the solutions to get their perspectives. And then they also thought about distributive justice um, in terms of how the different solutions that they suggested could have different impacts or kind of co-benefits for different groups. So for example, one of the solutions they proposed to reducing the cooling load was shading fermentation tanks, and they noted how that would also help to improve working conditions by lowering the temperatures near the tanks. Also along distributed justice lines, for this project considering EV charging infrastructure at UC Davis and how to expand it and improve it, then the students noted that for distributional equity, they should consider how the commuters and fleet services, so two different groups on campus, could share the chargers effectively. We can also think about distributive justice, not just in terms of locally who is impacted, but the students showed in this project, they were also thinking about the global context of who is impacted. So this project was looking at smart charging in Denmark, and the students wanted to point out that there are these global considerations of, when you're thinking about expanding charging infrastructure, we should also think about the materials that are used in order to do that. And those materials can sometimes come from these global south countries that rely on extractive practices that don't leave much benefit for the countries themselves. So we need to be mindful of that while we're thinking of, keeping on expanding like all of the electrification practices or charging networks and things like that. And then finally, this is the last example that I'll give. Is from the UC Davis hot water storage tank optimization project. And so these energy equity considerations that the students came up with, they relate to restorative justice in the sense that they're trying to right those historical harms, right? So for example, this project involves subcontracting, and they wanted to consider that small and minority-owned businesses historically have not had as much access to these types of projects. And one way to correct for that is to include a socially conscious score in the contract evaluation criteria that is used to decide, who gets a subcontract. Another example of that is they wanted to consider distributing the energy savings of the project to UC Davis diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. So yeah, these are the examples that students of how students applied equity to their projects, and hopefully that gives you some idea of how to apply equity to your projects going forward. I know it's kind of a lot of different examples, but what might be helpful is just remembering that there are these specific questions that relate to the dimensions of energy justice that you can then apply to your own projects going forward. And I'm including some quick links to the resources and different topics that I mentioned today. And yeah, I think so. We probably have some time for Q&A. I also have some questions for you if you are interested in answering in the chat. But yeah.
Excellent.
Oh, wait.
So I don't see anything in the chat unless I need to reload my chat. Are there any questions from people online? I guess one question I would have is how difficult do you find it to overcome the non-momentum of where people currently are? What have you seen that has worked to help kind of get momentum going for these types of projects or processes?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that I think the interesting thing is that people more often than not are willing to be engaged on these topics, or they want to make some sort of difference. And so when we talk to people about this, then they would like to do something about it. And I think the barrier is probably just they lack the time to learn about the concepts or to think about how they might apply this. But if we come to them with an idea that is related to equity, then they tend to be pretty on board with it, as long as they see kind of the other co-benefits as well for like the particular site, or client group that we're working with.
Excellent. All right. So I believe are we at the point where anybody can unmute themselves? Do we have that set, Nishant, so that people can unmute and ask questions if they have questions? I know you guys are
Yeah.
still there, so. Um, Mina, what are some of the questions that you have for us?
Yeah, I guess I was just wondering what was kind of the most useful information that people took away from the webinar, and what kind of topics that, like, questions that people have that are not answered through this presentation. What do people want to learn more about in terms of equity? And yeah, just curious if people are planning to apply it going forward, what that looks like for them.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and unmute myself. Can you hear me okay?
Yes,
Mhm.
thank you.
Okay, very good. Yeah, I did have some takeaways that I've jotted down. One was the criteria for measuring a dashboard's accessibility, which I think is really useful. So I'm going to take that back to our project teams. Appreciate that. And I had a question. You had a slide that had a table with numerous activities, and I didn't write down the slide number. I apologize. Um, there was some of the cell blocks were highlighted. Um,
Yeah,
there we go.
there's
Yeah. So I'm curious, what is stop the clock?
stop the clock. I think that had to do with one of the types of leave. I forget which type of leave it is exactly, but um, like not counting beyond a certain amount of leave. I may be remembering
Okay. Yeah.
incorrectly, but that is what I remember.
Thank you.
Can you tell me a little bit more about the just-in-time mentoring? I know we struggle getting mentoring programs going at work,
Mm-hmm.
and getting people to participate in them because it sounds like a long commitment. So this
Yeah.
sounds more
Mm-hmm.
interesting, that provides kind of that short snippet, but still has the opportunity to get that networking with somebody else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think there are some longer term mentoring programs at the lab where, you're paired with a mentor for a year or something like that,
Mhm.
just with one person. I think the just-in-time mentoring pilot, they got, several mentors, several mentees, and then I think they did this through Zoom, and you were mashed in a breakout room with, like, if you're a mentee with a mentor, and then you could ask them, whatever questions come to mind. And then you did that, swapped and did that several times. Yeah. So it's a way, if you have kind of immediate questions, to resolve those in one session.
Nice. Other questions from folks online? So we see a couple of comments online. All the specific examples you shared were so helpful to solidify the concepts. Thank you. And then thanks a lot for sharing this important topic. Doesn't look like there's many questions, but I definitely want to thank you, Mina, for being part of this webinar presentation today. I think it's definitely something that everyone is looking at ways to improve and include as we move forward. Not only in what appears to be easy ways, things like hiring, but also then broadening the concept to signage and choosing areas that could have been harmed in the past through activities, and now we're looking at how do we mitigate that, or how do we minimize that moving forward. So if there's no further questions from the group, I think we can say thank you everybody for attending. We'll make sure that we've got the recording available, and I believe also we'll be sharing the slide deck in PDF format afterwards, so that way everyone has that as an opportunity to go back and refer to as you're looking to maybe expand or adapt for your own environments.